lesson plans and teacher workshops. And we do that. And the third initiative is recording oral histories and producing these talk story events. It's our belief that the process of telling our stories and sharing them strengthens our community. These are our stories and our voices for our community strong. We have been doing this once a month for almost 10 years now, actually over 10 years. Once a month we've had a program, maybe sometimes two. Since the BLM movement, we added the Timeless Echoes series of occasional talks. Unlike talk story, echoes are talks to take an historical incident or issue and relate it to a current issue or problem so that we can better understand the problems that we face now and how we might want to deal with it. Now, today we have a distinguished panel, a really great group of people, and assembled by our associate, Susan Lee. A historical topic is the Page Act of 1875, and we are going to discuss how it intertwines throughout as a through line throughout our history into the recent surge of Asian hate crimes, and particularly into the killings at Atlanta. Our programs are supported by the Chinese American Citizens Alliance, OCA, Asian American Advocates, Chinatown Service Center, Chinese American History Museum of Washington, D.C. And in this program, we're particularly proud to have Panda Express support our programs. So without any more, and we'll meet you at the tail end of this, I'm going to pass it over to Susan. Susan is a student at Columbia University. She's a political science student and a very capable person who's also working on computer studies, right?
Yes, computer science and political science. Thank you, Ted, for the segue. So I'm just going to start off with a few logistical notes for everyone here. The session is going to be streamed live on Facebook, and later it's going to be uploaded to our Facebook and to the Foundation's website, 1882foundation.org. So you can access this recording later for your own reference, or if you want to show it to anyone else. So we are recording the session, and if you would prefer to not be recorded, please just turn off your camera at this time. As a guideline, we're going to be keeping everyone on mute for the duration of the event up until the post-event chat. However, please do feel free to introduce yourself and share any of your thoughts or comments in the chat, as well as any questions you might have for our panelists, and we'll try to address these during the Q&A period. We are going to have an open community discussion at the end of the event, where we'll have everyone in the audience being able to see each other and take folks off of mute if you wish to share any of your reflections out loud. In terms of more general community rules, this is a really difficult and I know for many a traumatic topic to talk about. So as we dive in, please just remember to both take space and make space. Offer your thoughts, but also let others have space to share as well. Please keep in mind to be open-minded and respectful and courteous of others' opinions and experiences. Use I statements where you can, so you're not speaking for anyone else. It is our hope that this can be a space for processing the collective grief and trauma that many of us in the Asian American community are still grappling with, and fostering a productive dialogue toward a more just world. So as you engage in conversation, remember to listen with the intent to understand where others are coming from and not just to reply. Ultimately, like I said, we've just wanted this to be space where folks are learning and growing together and from one another. So as you all know, probably today we'll be talking about the Page Act of 1875 and its lasting ramifications for Asian American politics, immigration, gender, and race in the present day. So the Page Act was the first act restricting immigration to the US, and it effectively barred Asian women from entering the US on suspicion of immoral purposes, i.e. prostitution. The Page Act in many ways codified the trope of the Chinese woman sex worker and legitimized anti-Asian racism, xenophobia, and hatred. This discourse has since been mobilized to enact policies of restriction, exclusion, and state violence, both domestically and abroad. In March 2021, Robert Aaron Long, a 21-year-old white male, went on a shooting spree in Atlanta, Georgia. Long targeted 3 Asian massage spas in his spree, murdering 8 individuals: Delana Ashley Yan, 33, Paul Andre Michaels, 54, Dao Yo Feng, 44, Xiao Jie Tian, 49, Soon Chung Park, 74. Oh, sorry. Can I just ask where I got cut off?
I think you had just finished reading the last name Park.
Okay, thank you. Soon Chung Park, 74, Soon Cha Kim, 69, Young A Yue, 63, and Hyun Jung Grant, 51. So before proceeding, I'd like to just take a moment of silence to remember those whose lives were cut too short. Okay, thank you. So following his arrest, Long cited his sex addiction as a motivation for the attacks and said that he viewed these massage parlors as a temptation. Long's statements are embedded within a long, complex, and cruel history of violence against Asian women, a pattern which has troublingly deepened over the course of the pandemic. Over this conversation, we hope that we can honor those who lost their lives 6 months ago, shed light on this history, and allow us to move into healing, active solidarity, and justice for the victims and all those in our community who continue to be affected. So originally we were planning to kick things off with a presentation by Professor Mae Ngai, who is a professor of history and Asian American studies at Columbia University. Unfortunately, Professor Ngai is experiencing an unexpected family emergency, so she won't be present with us today, but she has left us with some remarks to be read in her absence. So I'm gonna go ahead and present those now. Okay. On the Page Act of 1875. The Page Act was America's first Chinese exclusion law. It aimed to exclude both Chinese men and women, but for reasons that I will explain, it succeeded only in keeping out women. The Exclusion Act of 1882 set out to complete the job. The Page Act excluded Chinese and other Asian women on grounds that they were prostitutes. That is why we credit the Page Act with the origin of racist and misogynist stereotypes of Asian women as both sexually desirable and dangerous. It is the deep history that echoed in the murder of Asian spa workers in Atlanta earlier this year. The anti-Chinese movement, as we know, was a product of California politics. It had brewed since the 1850s over competition on the gold fields, and then in the 1870s when it assumed an urban character. During the gold rush, white American miners drove out Mexicans, Chileans, Australians, and the French, using nationalism as an excuse for competition. When they attacked the Chinese, though, they adopted a racial theory that Chinese were indentured workers, so-called coolies, and therefore an existential threat to free labor. This was a lie, but it associated Chinese with Black slaves and had resonance with anti-slavery politics during the lead up to the Civil War. During the 1870s, the white working men's movement in San Francisco attacked Chinese workers, again alleging competition from so-called coolie labor. The anti-Chinese movement was furious and violent, feeding on economic insecurities that were not actually caused by Chinese labor. Rather, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad had brought to California people and things from the East, people leaving unemployment in the East, which drove down wages in the West, as well as mass-produced cheap goods, which threatened craft workers and their guilds. The exclusion movement also targeted Chinese women, inciting a moral panic over Chinese prostitution. Yes, there were Chinese women engaged in sex work, but there were also wives of merchants, laborers, fishermen, and farmers. The Chinese prostitute became emblematic of all Chinese women imagined as slaves. So the coolie stereotype had both a male and a female version. But in the 1870s, it was not easy to pass a law excluding all Chinese immigrants. There were two obstacles. First, the Burlingame Treaty between the US and China, signed in 1868, had a provision allowing for free immigration between the two countries. This aimed to promote commerce and friendship. Anson Burlingame, for whom the treaty was named, was an American diplomat in China who had an anti-slavery background and was critical of the overt imperialistic ways of the British and other Europeans. He was actually enlisted by the Qing to represent China to negotiate a new treaty with the US. The treaty still contained unequal provisions, like those that exempted US citizens in China from Chinese law. But it recognized China's sovereignty over its interior and waterways, in addition to mutual rights of immigration. Second, in the mid-1870s, the federal government had not yet pulled back from its commitments to Black equality in the post-Civil War South. Congress had passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, outlawing slavery, establishing citizenship of the former slaves, and the right to vote. There was a fierce struggle taking place on the ground in the South, with Ku Klux Klan violence on the one hand, and 16 African Americans serving in the US Congress, and over 600 in Southern state legislatures on the other hand. It was not until 1877 that the North withdrew federal troops from the South and basically handed the South back to white elites, both the old planters and the new industrialists. The Page Act was a workaround the Burlingame Treaty. It explicitly excluded contract laborers and prostitutes, those who were not brought to the US, quote unquote, of their own free will, and those brought to, quote unquote, lewd and immoral purposes. It specifically forbid the, quote, importation of women for purposes of prostitution. It did not prohibit free immigration because contract workers and prostitutes were defined as unfree labor. The emphasis on unfree labor also appealed to the ethos of anti-slavery and Reconstruction. The Page Act failed to stop the immigration of Chinese men who were not indentured workers. This was ironically a proof that Chinese were not coolies. But the Page Act did virtually stop female immigration, not because all Chinese women were prostitutes, but because the law stipulated that Chinese women had to present an affirmative affidavit that they were not prostitutes before they could leave China. This procedure subjected women to humiliating interrogation and examination. As we know, it's difficult to prove a negative. Cultural markers supposedly identifying class status were insufficient. A woman with bound feet could be the wife of a merchant or a high-class madame. Someone with calloused hands could be a peasant woman or the daughter of a poor peasant sold into slavery. As a result of the Page Act, the number of Chinese female immigrants plummeted. There was already a skewed gender ratio. In the early 1870s, there were roughly 78 Chinese women per 1,000 Chinese men. This reflected patterns established during the gold rush, when gold seekers of all nationalities were predominantly solo men. But there was a cultural element as well, as Chinese custom held that a wife should live in the home of the husband's parents. During the era of mass migration to distant places, that custom served to tether the male immigrant to the patrilineal family. But still, there were women who immigrated, merchants and laborers' wives, as well as sex workers. After the Page Act, the Chinese gender ratio dropped to 48 women per 1,000 men. The exclusion of Chinese women from immigration was a great victory for the anti-Chinese movement. It meant that Chinese would not be able to establish viable communities with families. They would not be able to grow by population accretion through natural reproduction. The anti-Chinese movement was not satisfied, however, and continued to press for the full exclusion of the Chinese. First, it lobbied President Chester Arthur to renegotiate the Burlingame Treaty to allow for the temporary suspension of immigration in 1880. Then in 1882, Congress passed the first Chinese exclusion law, suspending immigration of all laborers for 10 years. It exempted merchants, clergy, and students, so it wasn't absolute, but it did have an absolute racial logic in its exclusion of all Chinese from naturalized US citizenship. It's worth noting too that passage of the exclusion law by Congress was made possible by an allowance of the South and the West, the two bastions of white supremacy that flourished in the wake of Reconstruction's demise, indeed pillars of conservative and white supremacist politics to this day. We can certainly see the deep historical roots of the anti-Chinese, anti-Asian misogyny so brutally enacted in Atlanta last March in the Page Act. But it's not a simple line between 1875 and 2021. Racism is produced in history, but it also has to be reproduced as contexts and conditions change over time. Racist and sexist stereotypes of Asian women were reproduced by the ongoing demographic imbalances in Chinese American communities, which persisted through the mid-20th century, but also the persistence of US wars and military occupations in the Asia Pacific, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Guam, the Philippines, and the cultures and industry of military sex and prostitution constructed in the context of general wartime ideology that Asian life is cheap, but targeting Asian women as sexually desirable, accessible, passive, but also dangerous and cunning. These views of Asian women are reproduced domestically through war movies and TV shows, but also as tens of thousands of American servicemen who served in the Asia Pacific to the US and constitute a large clientele, not exclusively, but a large clientele for massage and sex workers, or those who seek Asian partners through mail order brides and dating services. So that is all that Professor Ngai left me with. I'm going to turn things over to Professor Janelle Wong, who is our moderator for this next section of the event, for her comments and introductions. Professor Wong is Professor of American Studies, Government and Politics, and core faculty in the Asian American Studies program at the University of Maryland, College Park. Take it over, Janelle.
Thank you so much, Susan. And I think we really owe a debt of gratitude to Susan for taking over that role of reading Professor Mae Ngai's remarks. And I think it's clear there's a lot, even though those remarks were fairly succinct, there's a lot to unpack there. And we have the perfect panel to do so. And so I want to introduce, and then we will kick it off, our panelists today. And thank you, panelists, for being here. Our first panelist is Lily Wong, who is an associate professor in the departments of literature and critical race, gender, and culture studies at American University. Next, Yanhu Cho is an outreach organizer at Red Canary Song, a New York-based collective for Asian migrant sex and massage workers. Sue-Ellen Cheng is national historian of the Chinese American Citizens Alliance, the oldest Asian American civil rights organization continuously operating since 1895. And Lorelei Lee, is a sex worker organizer, Justice Catalyst Fellow, Juris Doctor, and writer. This is going to be a fantastic conversation. And to get us started, I would love to just ask Lily Wong, Professor Lily Wong, to offer some reflections on these remarks and maybe some examples from your own work, because I know you have also done quite a bit of work on the Page Act and, connections with the recent events in Atlanta that may inform one another, or how they connect, how your work connects to these themes, these key concepts. And then most importantly, how do we productively move forward with what we have heard today? Because I could tell the panelists were really reacting to some of these, some of the content that was shared. So Dr. Wong.
Thank you, Janelle. Thank you everyone for being here. And first of all, I just want to thank all the folks at 1882 Foundation, specifically Susan Lee, who has just been tirelessly working on this for months to make this conversation possible. So I'm so thankful for this. I'm also so honored to join this panel of organizers, activists, and scholars who I've just really long admired and have been following their work for a very long time. And I'm just really eager to hear from them and learn from them today. So I'm just going to keep my remarks short, and I'm happy to talk more during the Q&A, but I really want to hold more space for folks that are kind of organizing and do this work on the ground. So Professor Nai's contextualization of the Page Act shows really, right, how anti-Asian racism within the US has always been an intersectional operation of power, right? So the discourses that came up after Atlanta that's trying to kind of disaggregate, racialization with sexualization and gender politics doesn't really work because it's always been, right, an intersectional imagination or operation, right? So sexualized and racialized violence against working class, specifically Asian American, and migrant subjects in the US is actually at the core of the way immigration acts such as the Page Act has been crafted, right? And so I'm really thankful for the remarks to kind of set that up today. Perhaps what I could come in with the work that I've been doing is I do trace the kind of cultural and material ramifications of immigration acts like the Page Act that kind of codified this imagination of Asian women as sex workers, and how that kind of threads through in our cultural imaginary, but also produces material responses in terms of policy, in terms of cultural production, in terms of the ways in which we understand our relationship to each other even till today, right? So I'll perhaps just start furthering that link from the Page Act into the ways in which, like Professor Nai kind of mentioned, is this kind of uneven but also layered process of threading towards then our understanding of the Atlanta murders just this past spring. I think where I would start is kind of when there started to be conversations about whether or not the massage parlor workers in Atlanta actually engaged in sex work, right? There was fierce debate about this in public discourse. I found that the general emotional responses I saw in public discussions seem to fall into very kind of polarizing discourses. One of, knee-jerk distancing, right? So the framework of shaming or criminalization of sex work, the kind of knee-jerk reaction that no, they're massage parlor workers, not sex workers, so on and so forth. So this is kind of one popular kind of reaction that I saw. And another popular reaction that I saw was also kind of narratives of rescue, right? And which kind of immediately reduces these workers to victims of sex trafficking. And so as we can see in the history of the Page Act, right, such popularized narratives of criminalization and or rescue has very, very material consequences, right? So for instance, the conflation, right, of sex work and sex trafficking through this kind of dual imagination of either criminalization and or rescue was truly central to the logic and impact of the 1875 Page Act. The act justified domestic race and class-based exclusion in the US due to the fear, right, of sex trafficking, or to kind of Professor Nai's comments, this imagination of unfree labor, right, that kind of dovetailed with the national conversation of slavery and dovetailed with the national conversation of abolition at the same time, right? And it also legitimized through the affect of civilizing rescue. And this is really important that it kind of reaches beyond the U.S. borders, that this narrative of civilizing rescue, right, to rescue Chinese women from their own men. So I could talk more about this during the Q&A, but the imagination of Asian women as sex workers, unless proven otherwise, was framed as a specifically Chinese issue. That was specifically a Chinese cultural issue and problem due to feudal histories, right? And I won't go into detail here, but I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A if folks are interested. But that also allowed openings then to think through US imperial expansion, right? And militarization abroad to save Chinese women from their own men, right? To then go on a civilizational expansion into the Asia Pacific to save, right, to rescue, right, these women from their unfree situation, right? So you see the mobilization of these discourses of criminalization and or rescue operating at the same time domestically, but also abroad, right? So if we look at the expansion of the US empire during the Cold War in particular, right? We see then the long history of sexual violence, not only during military conquest, but also through the ongoing military presence on bases, rest and recreation stations, or camp towns throughout Asia and the Pacific, which is ongoing today. But also how this sexual economy and infrastructure really does lead back into the US. So Christine Ahn, Terry Park, and Kathleen Richards' piece in The Nation addresses this historical connection very clearly. I believe my fellow panelist, Lorelei Lee, will also talk on this a bit, so I won't go too much in this, but I do want to emphasize that it's important to contextualize the events in Atlanta with these larger histories of immigration, militarization, and empire. I do want to highlight one other issue is that about our current moment, this kind of moment in the wake of Atlanta, that this narrative of affective shaming or stigmatizing or criminalizing of sex work in particular also brings up concerns about carceral responses. So here I'm thinking about the ways currently the language of hate crimes or anti-Asian hate seem to mobilize discourses of crime waves that lawmakers are using to justify carceral responses, such as increasing policing and strengthening hate crime laws or anti-trafficking legislation. Now, this brings up the question, right, of whether or not such policing or legislation would actually help those who are most affected by this violence and those who are most vulnerable in our communities. So these questions should really press us together, right, as folks that identify as being a part of the Asian American community, to find non-carceral ways to support each other and to keep each other safe. And finally, to respond to Janelle's last question of how we can productively move forward, I really just can't wait to hear from my fellow panelists of the work that they've already been doing for a very, very long time. But for now, as kind of my positionality as an academic, as an educator, as someone that crosses cultural sectors, I join in the calls that many others are already sounding. And what I believe we are trying to do here in this conversation today, that we need to understand the murders in Atlanta not as an individualized, exceptional case of violence, but as a tragedy, right, that is symptomatic of the histories and the material operations of power that we have inherited and must reckon with and restructure together. It seems imperative then to join in the work that I see my fellow panelists already doing for many years, for decades. To engage with and support the work of sex worker justice, of Asian and Asian American feminist, abolitionist, and queer-centered work against white supremacy and state violence. That is, and this goes into the kind of comparative racial kind of context that Professor Ngai's comments had brought in, that this kind of work also needs to be in dialogue with, of course, Black, Indigenous, and other minoritized communities, anti-colonial and decolonial justice thinkers and workers. The only thing that I would add, and this will be my last point, is to also think beyond the structuring forces of US empire, as we've seen in the kind of transnational impact of the Page Act. This anti-Asian violence that we're seeing today is occurring amid a global pandemic, a pandemic which uneven effects have exposed and intensified overlapping structures of inequality around the world. And in addition to worldwide spread of xenophobic and anti-immigrant rhetoric, this is not just something that we're dealing with in the US context in particular. We're seeing this around the world, that this sense of crisis has also worked to legitimize authoritarian repression and state-led militarization. And so this moment really calls for us to reckon with these histories and really calling for the urgency of coalition building, for us to turn to each other and to restructure these paradigms. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wong, for really bringing some of these pressing issues of the past to the fore. I think those were really powerful insights that you shared. And I see some questions coming in to the chat, and we will definitely be addressing those shortly. But I wanted to turn to Yan-Hu Cho, who has been working with an organization that, as Dr. Wong said, has been long active in these areas. These are not new issues, but they gained a kind of national spotlight with the shootings in Atlanta. So Yan-Hu, just in terms of reflecting on these events, past and present. We'd just love to hear your perspectives.
Hello. Thanks, Susan, Janelle, and Lily, and everyone in the 1882 Foundation for opening up this space to engage us about the Page Act and its ongoing legacy. I'm so honored to be part of this talk and to talk about the work of Red Canary Song as we support and build community with the Asian massage and sex workers based in Flushing, New York City. And so informing these workers that we work, who are part of our community, our collective, of the history of Page Act, and helping them reckon with it and have the workers lead the process and make the demands of what they would want to see in the future is something Red Canary tried to do with the massage workers who are part of our collective. And I can share in my talk how we have attempted to incorporate the voices of the most directly impacted folks who have formed their own perspectives from their own lived experiences in the present. But before that, I can introduce myself a little more. My name is Yeonhoo Cho, and I am from Seoul, South Korea, and I work as a part of an outreach team at Red Canary Song, which is a New York-based collective for Asian massage and sex workers. And we center base building with migrant workers through a labor rights framework and mutual aid in order to combat this polarizing discourse, to quote Lily, we see around in the very recent and very ongoing tragedy. We believe that full decriminalization of sex work is necessary for labor organizing and anti-trafficking. Currently in the outreach team, we provide various services such as OBGYN checkups, legal assistance, and mutual aid, and various community building activities, well-being activities. And one of them being distributing festival food for the upcoming Moon Festival this month, prominently in Korean and Chinese speaking massage workers. We talk about the history of Page Act and its legacy in the current US policing regime. I want to add that it is in this historical context that we have been thinking about how to continue this dialogue so that we can really move forward with regard to all the present issues. And I believe that it is in this dialogue that we should continue to incorporate the non-English speaking, economically disadvantaged folks in the Asian diaspora who are directly impacted by this history of racist, sexist, moral panic. And I was kind of ruminating on this word dialogue, and I think I specifically want to say dialogue because I'm thinking about a quote by Bell Hooks, which reads that dialogue implies talk between two subjects, not the speech of subject and object. It is a humanizing speech, one that challenges and resists domination. And one thing I want to say is that there is so much room for creativity in how the legacy of the same policing regime since 1875 with the same kind of racism and moral painting around Asian women can only be subverted. And in my relationships with Korean massage workers in Flushing, it's truly striking how there are so many untold lived experiences as early as 1960s that these workers are eager to tell the world. And one thing I appreciate is that a lot of massage workers have their own ways of diagnosing the US and historicizing the US from their perspectives that are informed by their own lived experiences, experiencing this, one of the most toughest policing in this country. And they have molded this viewpoint living through this country despite the prevailing myth that dehumanizes us, that really creates this fiction of omnipotent and ever benevolent US dominating the world since forever, through the wartime, both in the US and also in their home countries, unfortunately. And we only notice how variegated their voices are, just by talking to them, and you will immediately notice it. One worker, for example, thinks sex work and massage work are forms of art because of the high level of emotional skills and body expression these work require. And another worker has developed the language to speak back to their homophobic elders in the immigrant community in New York by telling them that sex workers, the South Korean sex workers in the US in the 1990s were the true patriots to Korea because of the remittances they would send to the family to overcome the IMF crisis that was happening in South Korea, even when they were living in New York and working as sex worker and massage workers. And well, I think this narrative really, they choose this narrative deliberately to speak to their audience and their community, and is effective. And this is how she expresses her pride and bring meaning to her life that she herself has validated. And I really hope, well, I think it's really important to place the US state in scrutiny from the perspective of these migrant workers, from both local and global perspectives is so important. And I think it really reorients us to what's important, despite the misfocused discourse that we see. And I guess for all of us, but especially for researchers and academics, I hope that the kind of research that we practice in the future comes with an attitude that are stimulating this conversation in a caring and ethical way. And because these workers often don't get the chance to be on a platform like this, I want to share some ways Red Canary Song has attempted to bring them more to the main platform, mainly through social media and through our connections with other organizations that are in solidarity relationships with, and also in our more official meetings in like state level Department of Justice or some other like mega $1 million funded anti-trafficking organizations, is that we are, well, one thing that we do is that we have a group of really talented massage workers who are great painters and poets, and we have been creating this small working group where they can share their own art, and so that we can also amplify their art through our social media, and even finding ways for them to sell their own art through potentially an auction in the future. And another work that we are trying to launch in the near future is that we are trying to work with other sex work organizations in 3 other different cities, in Seattle, Providence, Rhode Island, and Toronto across North America, to make demands about each city's licensing legislatures, because we all know that the anti-prostitution laws federally is recognized. And the prostitution is federally recognized as a felony, and it's the direct cause of all these policing and arrests that these workers experience. But we also, I want to bring this to the table. The licensing laws across the country is very seemingly boring, so many people don't care about it, and it's actually exactly why a lot of the law enforcement agencies use that law to police these workers on a very racist and sexist mindset without having to prove that they are doing sex work. And so I think that's one part of the larger politics in the current time that we are trying to tackle, and to remove this punitive and carceral approach to all these Asian women who are practicing massage, not necessarily sex work, but without a license, and that still criminalizes their body and their work. And so, yeah, expect a joint campaigns through that we are trying to do in collaboration with other organizations, including Butterfly Collective in Toronto. And we're also deeply involved in the anti-gentrification movement of Chinatown in New York, as it also impacts the workers that we are part of our collective. And we see all these issues as directly embedded in each other. Yeah, thank you so much for being here. You're all my neighbors. And again, I'm very honored to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yanhu, and I hope we have a chance to return to some of the themes and the work that you have described. And, you know, I think we're also hearing the importance of like which lens we use to understand these issues. Is it through labor? Is it through exploitation? And then is there another way in which we can keep thinking about the way the system keeps repeating the same kind of exploitative relationships, including between academics and the communities, and to what extent can we do more as academics to be more community engaged and community responsive. So I appreciate that a lot. And this brings us to Sue Ellen Cheng, who has also been very deeply involved in community-based work and creating an archive for our communities around these very issues. So let me turn it over to Sue Ellen to build on this, and then we will round out again with a more contemporary perspective related to work on the ground with Lorelei Lee.
Thank you. And again, thank you for inviting me to be here. And again, you know, I'm here really to learn a lot, you know, about, you know, the current issues. However, today my job is pretty much kind of bring you another example more in the past. You know, fighting against racism and the sexism have been extremely challenging for the Asian Americans in the past, as you know, as it is today. Just to give you an example, I would like to share the Chinese American Citizens Alliance, a decades-long legislative struggle for securing admission of Chinese wives of American citizens to the United States, and the struggle for ending the inhumane separation of the Chinese women from their husbands and sometimes their children in the United States. The Chinese American Citizens Alliance was founded in 1895 by a group of young American-born Chinese advocating for their citizens' rights and for improving their socio-political status. And since its founding, CACA, along with other Chinese community organizations, such as the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association and the dedicated individuals, spent many decades via court battles and the political campaigns to reverse the hardship that the anti-Chinese laws had caused the Chinese. CACA was particularly instrumental in lobbying the Congress to amend the 1924 Immigration Act to permit the entry of Chinese alien wives of US citizens. But it was not done without struggle. As we talk about the passage of the Page Act in 1875, the US government really made it extremely difficult for Chinese women to join their husband in America, as discussed before. However, in 1902, Chinese American community was successfully established a case in which an alien Chinese wife of American citizens was able to gain the right to reside with her husband according to existing laws for married women. This rule, however, stood for about only 2 decades, and until the Immigration Act of 1924 that added new criteria that further excluded those of Asian descent. CACA and other Chinese American community organizations form a committee to challenge this unfair new law. The committee's top priority was to raise money to hire lawyers and secure admission for the wives of citizens and the merchants. The appeal for the merchant's wife was successful. However, the appeals by citizens' wives were turned down. It became useless for Chinese Americans to address their grievance to the court now. So as the court justice suggested, because the judge had to go by the laws, the only way they could do is to depend on the Congress to pass the law. It's like today, you look at the Supreme Court, they refuse to shut down certain type of laws, and we will have to depend on the Congress to pass the laws. Hopefully that is the passage. So to focus on the argument of the citizens' rights, the CACA, an organization of American-born Chinese who have the right to vote, decided to lead in this new legislative fight. At its 1925 National Convention, CACA officially authorized a lobbying campaign to repeal the law that barred the entry of Chinese wives of citizens. In 1926, the Congress received bills to amend this act with a lot of lobbying efforts from the community led by CACA. Appearing before a House Immigration and Naturalization Committee were active members of the CACA who repeatedly argued that an American citizen should have the right to his wife's companionship and that he should be entitled to no less protection than alien Chinese merchants. As a political strategy, Chinese Americans convinced the House committee that their request would not lead to an influx of Chinese immigrants because the number of American-born Chinese was very small, and that Chinese women would not compete with American workers for jobs. They also emphasized that letting Chinese American citizens have their families in the US would discourage interracial marriage. And these are their strategy to respond at that time, respond to all the fears that you all talk about historically. As a result of CAC efforts, Congress passed the Act of 1930s, amended the 1924 Immigration Act by granting the entry to alien Chinese wives of American citizens, but only for those who had married prior to May 6, 1924. And those citizens who married after May 6, 1924 were still separated from their alien Chinese wives. This was, however, the best deal that Chinese Americans could do and could negotiate then. After 1930, the CACA continued raising funds in hoping of further amending the 1924 Act. In 1943, new bills were introduced and pushed aside. And between 1930 and 1946, Chinese, tirelessly lobby their Congress members to introduce at least 8 more bills in, each congressional sessions, requesting unlimited admission of alien Chinese wives, meaning it's not only the merchants, but all, Chinese wives of American citizens included. In late 1946, Congress finally passed a bill that granted all Chinese American citizens the right to bring their wives as non-quota immigrants. The act ended the 20-year battle. Sadly, it was a long and difficult struggle to regain their basic citizens' rights and human rights too. Many Chinese American citizens never had the chance to unite with their wives, including the person, Lo Chu, who actually led the campaign fundraising effort. At the end, was not able to bring his own wife to this country. So after a long separation, those who eventually arrived in the United States had to face yet many challenges of adjusting their lives in unfamiliar environments, both at home and in the new land. So, moving forward, the Chinese American Citizens Alliance today continues to advocate for civil rights and currently working on several projects and hoping to collaborate with other organizations to condemn anti-Asian hate, to advocate Asian American studies in K-12 curricula. Hopefully that will include many subjects and knowledge that we all brought up today, and to educate our young students. And we also advocate to and support the congressional action to pass legislation offering a permanent solution for Dreamers, to support national police reform, and for better community public safety. And so mostly we also to promote historic preservation for Chinese Americans. And historical events that was invisible to the public, hopefully we were able to also promote those knowledge. So that's what I have to share with you. Thank you so much.
Sorry about that. I'm having a little technical issue. So I wanted to invite Lorelei to both introduce yourself. I may be saying your name wrong, so please introduce yourself so we can hear your name said correctly. And also to comment, I think it would be a really excellent follow-up to bring these issues into the contemporary work you're doing today, organizing sex workers. We really appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much. And I mean, just thank you so much for putting this panel together and for all of your work. I am for all of your work, everyone on this panel for all of your work. I am just really overwhelmed with gratitude for being here. I'm really honored to be speaking with all of you. And my name is Lorelei, so you did pronounce it correctly. I thought I would start by just saying that my entry point into studying the Page Act and wanting to understand its history is my own experience as a sex worker and trafficking survivor, and who spent many years with my co-workers just trying to figure out what these systems were that were causing all kinds of harm in our lives. And in order to figure that out, I decided to go to the legal history. And I find that to be an incredibly rich source when we're trying to understand things that sometimes seem just hateful in an invisible way, that interfere with our lives and cause violence in our lives, and seem to have no reason behind them. And, you know, there is an extent to which we can say there is no reason because there's no good reason. But we can start to understand where the attitudes are coming from and what these hateful motivations are coming from out of 200 years of American history, and creating these structural racisms that underlie the individual hateful behavior. So my approach to the Page Act was to try to understand it as one origin point also for, so it's an origin point obviously for anti-Asian racism, and for specifically anti-Asian racism as it intersects with misogyny. And it is also an origin point for understanding anti-sex work stigma, and how anti-sex work stigma is very deeply racialized and cannot be separated from its racialized roots. So as other folks have mentioned, I think as Lily has talked about, one attitude, one narrative that we see developed out of the era in which the Page Act was passed is this narrative of the both the dangerous Asian woman as sex worker, as well as the victimized Asian woman as sex worker. And so that those two ideas were sort of coexisting in approaches to sex work prior to the 19th century, or in the early part of the 19th century, and at the end of the 19th century, so simultaneous with these economic concerns that other folks have already talked about, you have the beginnings of the first wave of American feminism that is primarily white women, that is primarily focused on obtaining the vote for white women. And that feminist group has deep ties to the purity movement. And the purity movement is looking to prohibit alcohol, but they're also looking at sex work in a very specific way and trying to respond to previous ideas of sex workers as evil, as temptresses, as harming men, with the idea that men are actually doing the harming of sex workers, and that sex workers themselves are just victimized. And so that dialogue is happening simultaneous with this American imperialism project that Professor Wong has spoken about. And so you see in California, as this anti-Asian rhetoric is escalating, white women coming into California to do a kind of imperialism at home, which is the rescue of Asian and Asian American sex workers from brothels in the late 1800s. And you have characters like Donaldina Cameron, who opens a rescue home where she goes with police officers to raid brothels in a way that really mirrors some of the brothel raids that we see today. And we see journalists going along with police officers on these raids. So there is this industry that has deep ties to policing, and also is about gaining notoriety as journalists or as humanitarians, but in a very racialized and very condescending way. And so Donaldina Cameron goes on these rescue missions. She brings sex workers back to the home that she's created, and in that home, those workers are not allowed to leave to receive outside like letters. Their letters are all being read, and they're being trained in sewing and cleaning and in how to become good Christian wives. And so we don't have something that strikes me in doing this research, and I have written one piece that's out there that talks about this, is how little we have from the voices of sex working Asian women themselves. And so our ability to understand the position that these women might have been in is so limited. It mostly comes through folks like Donaldina Cameron recording their voices through their lens of Christian rescue and through this idea that that China as a country, Asia as a continent, is a place where white women should be going to rescue Chinese and Asian women from, as others have already mentioned, from their men, from their culture, from their parents, seeing the entire culture as victimizing. And I think we can see really direct connections to the present day when we think about that, because we continue to have the white feminism that sees these kinds of projects of rescue, not just, first of all, of Asian sex workers who actually in the present day we know have very robust organizing happening in, for example, Thailand, in India, and are very capable of speaking for themselves. And yet we still have the really an industry of American women doing a kind of just imperialist project abroad. And also we can see that as we are thinking about the 20th anniversary of 9/11 and how it implicates some of these rescue narratives as they've been imposed also on Arab and Muslim women, and as they've also been imposed on Central Asian women. And how those narratives, those feminist narratives, become for the left a moral justification for upholding racist stereotypes. And on the right, similarly, you have religious projects of rescue that become for the right. I mean, I think we've seen these trafficking sort of conspiracy theories that have been developed on the right, and how these become a moral imperative for racist and imperialist projects on the right. And so you have the right and the left sort of coming to an agreement about this, and so therefore like upholding, reifying, continuing these stereotypes. And then something else that I wanted to mention that has come up. So this rhetoric that continues, by the way, gets used in the passage of anti-trafficking laws like FOSTA, which the rhetoric that gets used in Congress completely matches the rhetoric that was used in 1875 to pass the Page Act, and it's scare tactics around the idea of these ideas of contagion and of slavery, modern day slavery, which mirror what was said in 1875 about Chinese workers specifically, that they were bringing slavery into the supposedly anti-slavery nation of the United States. And that contagion rhetoric takes a lot of forms. It also makes its way into the massage parlor regulations that Yan Hu mentioned, that the way that we see criminalization happening of massage parlors is different from the way we see criminalization happening of Black sex workers and of white sex workers, that it happens through these massage parlor regulations that suggest that these workers are unclean in some way, that they might be spreading disease and illness. And that can be tied just directly back to these fears about syphilis that were being talked about in the 1800s, but also were very deeply connected to new ideas about racialization happening through blood and through through white men seeing Chinese sex workers. So that syphilis was sort of one claim, but when it was being written about, they used language such as the contagion that is destroying the Anglo-Saxon blood. And So we have these ties that are a little bit like terrifying in some ways, because we can just see how the same language takes shape over time again and again. These tired tropes get reused in order to justify new policies. And I'm sorry, I feel like I might be talking too long. But the last thing I thought I would just mention is how and this is not my observation, this is Nina Lowe, who has done a bunch of work on contemporary militarization around the US and China, and how the United States now has 400 military bases that ring China and the Asia Pacific. And we, out of 800 total military bases, whereas China has between 1 and 3 bases outside of China. However, the US has been continuing to position that as though we're on the defensive against a incursion by China. And that, I think that incursion, that sort of scary symbol that they're trying to put out there, is one that is both about that values or culture, like fear of values or culture, as well as this supposed threat of military action that is really seems to be a fiction. So maybe I'll just stop there. I don't know how to neatly close it up, but yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for pulling out some of those threads, because I think we can continue to build this conversation around them. And I think before we get to Q&A, because we do have a little bit of time, I'd love to ask the panelists, just, you know, I think this is a great chance for you all to respond to one another for a couple of minutes. And so would love to just ask, I'm going to go back to Lily here and just ask you to respond to anyone else's comments, and I'll just quickly go around. Just take please a minute or two.
I just want to thank my fellow panelists, because, you know, all of your remarks really bring to the fore the precision we actually really need, right? In terms of, it's not just about dismantling these narratives that are harmful, right? That like lead into carcerality, but actually we have to be very precise, right? In the ways in which particular racializations and particular sexualizations actually operate in different occupations and different labor forms, that of course we can join an alliance, but it is very uneven, right? And the particularity of Asian massage parlor workers and or Asian migrant workers, right? And also, Yan-Hu, you brought up this really amazing point that I think dovetails with all the other panelists, is that we also need to think through migration itself, right? If we think about the US frame itself as too limiting, right? And also thinking through then, especially Lorelei reminded us, right? So much of this was a white supremacist project to secure blood, right? And so if this is a question that links into other projects like reproductive justice, questions of white supremacy, right? And also the question about a settler state, right? What is the legitimacy of the settler state as well? And so I think this links up to other questions, and then you all kind of bring in the precision that I'm really thankful of. So I just wanted to kind of add on to that and just echo and uplift the kind of interventions that you all are making.
And Yan-Hu, did you want to respond to anyone else?
Well, I can also take some time to go over the chat and maybe read the comments that questions.
Yeah, we will definitely do that in a minute. I'll read out some of the questions that you can respond. But in terms of just your you know, any remarks from the panelists themselves.
Yeah, I was really glad when Lorelei mentioned about the so-called anti-trafficking industrial complex of these white feminists coming in to rescue these Asian massage and sex workers. And I think that reminded me of one project that is famously called Polaris Project, which started from an effort to with the same kind of effort and and just pointing to the fact that this multi-million dollars funded initiative has even collaborated with the law enforcement, and to go into like locating all the spas in the neighborhoods in the name of rescue, and back in 2015 or 16 has resulted in numerous deportations and arrests because of this organizations that still exist and continue to work with the federal government. And yeah, I think that quote about doing imperialism at home really hits hard. And one of the one of the executive positions in the Polaris project has even justified the building the wall in between the US-Mexico border narrative through this project, saying that those initiatives will save the young, poor, helpless girls and boys who are being trafficked into these into the US from Central America. And I think it definitely, this conversation definitely has to come hand in hand with conversation about migration, and also recognizing the particularities of different borders, different forms of migrations, and of different parts of history.
Sue Ellen, did you want to chime in?
I just have, I'm just really kind of totally overwhelmed with all these, you know, many new challenges that in front of all of us. And it seems to me, you know, historically, we make one step ahead, and the new challenges that make us back, you know, 2 more steps or even more. And how are we going to confront this? And of course, we, you all talk about legal systems, and the only way, probably the lessons that we learned from the CACA fight is that we were only one small organization, and it took 2 more, you know, 2 decades to gain so little, you know. And is a lesson that we can learn from it is that would it be more effective that we, you know, collaborate with others and gaining support with others? And that is a hard conversation that we all probably have to address, that how do we bring in, you know, people that seemingly first, you know knowledge, and secondly, you know, can, you know, relate and, you know, to our calling. And those are the big challenges. And I think maybe one thing that we will say is that we really need to look into the alliance to, you know, build that coalition and to advance our agenda. And that's, you know, I think the things that we probably all have to work harder.
Definitely, I know the panelists featured here are doing a lot of that work of kind of both of coalitional work across racial lines and other kinds of important identity categories, especially among marginalized groups. So we can continue on that conversation, I'm sure. I wanted to just give Lorelei a chance to respond to other comments, and then we'll open it up for Q&A.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I am actually just really struck by Sue Ellen's comments about coalition building. And, you know, I was thinking earlier while Sue Ellen was talking about the difficulty of getting folks brides here, that there is such a profound connection between the work that I do regularly, which is sex worker organizing work, and the work that Sue Ellen was describing, in that we're both working against state control of families and state control of the families that we're allowed to have. And in my work, I mean, definitely, there's a lot of different kinds of coalition building that we do. And we think about, especially if we're working on policy, we think about, okay, who else is being heard on a similar issue, who has some kind of status at this moment, like politicians care in June about Pride Month. You know what I mean? It's such a, there in many ways, it is such a grotesque game, political game to do that. But when you are building the coalition in a deeper way, be outside of, you know, those political moves, you can come to that moment knowing that your the groups that you're working with are actually building relationships and learning more about where these oppressive regimes like meet each other in a way that's really deep, and I think takes things forward in a much stronger way. And so you can play that policy game, but simultaneously be building something real and human. And I think that that is the kind of coalition building that I care about most, and I really hope to keep doing.
I really appreciate that. We tend to be so dichotomous about our thinking about, you know, political strategy versus building relationally, and we don't necessarily have to do one thing or the other. We can do we can approach these issues in a more holistic way. So thank you for that, Lorelei. Let's move to the Q&A portion, and I want to turn to Susan Lee, who has a question for the panel.
Sorry to jump ahead of everyone, but first of all, thank you all so much for sharing all of your experiences and your insights. I've learned so much over the course of this panel from every one of you. It's really incredible. And just like, thank you all for honoring us with your presence today. I guess what I find really striking about what a lot of you touched upon is that you're all from such different backgrounds, different kinds of work, but you all are struggling with these histories and clearly like grappling with a lot of the silences that are in the archive and the limitations of that. And so I was just wondering, for all of you working in or around history, how do you work, or how have you worked with the archives and the materials that are left by these women? And then how do you intervene when you are faced with those limitations, you know, many of these silences that are imposed or constructed as well? And how do you resurrect the subjectivities of women who are criminalized, or like we said, like made into objects of rescue or seen as figures that aren't capable of history or politics?
What a great question. I think maybe Lily and Lorelei and then Sue Ellen can talk a little bit about this.
Actually, I would like to let Lorelei and Sue Ellen go first. Just want to kind of center their voice first, and then I could come in and add if needed.
I'm pretty much, sharing that frustration of not being able to hear and their own experiences. And it is very difficult. And even we see the accounts in the old newspapers, again, like Laura is saying, that, from whose perspective and whose interpretation, and based on, what kind of narratives that they are reporting on. And it's kind of hard to try, we're still trying to dig whatever we could. But on the other hand, I always stress the fact that whatever we could do, and I know everyone has handfuls, that to, start collecting the stories as much as we could right now. And I know that takes maybe the academic, those who are professors and the students could help a lot, gathering those oral histories. And even like the Library of Congress, have these talk stories, and 1882 Foundation has these talk stories programs that we just inject our stories, whether is seemingly is welcome or invited. We just have to invite ourselves to inject into that narrative.
And I was actually thinking that some of Yanhu's comments earlier directly get to this question as well. So let's hear from Yanhu and then Lorelei.
Yeah, one thing Red Canary Song has done recently is to have one of the current or former massage worker as part of our collective in a hired position. And so that we asked them to lay out the mutual aid program, as well as reorient ourselves in our mission statement, and flesh out the demands that we would want to ask to the government and the law enforcement agency and the community, and really center this group's voice into every single work that we do. And they all get a voting rights in whenever there is a larger level of decision that is to be made for the organization. And I think those things are something that we do in order to facilitate more stories are in dialogue with each other. And we, even within the organization, like, it's not that everyone share the same view or share the same background just because we are mostly Asian American women, Asian American women. And even those tensions that may arise from having different viewpoints even within Red Canary Song always get solved when we really sit down and talk to each other, and through multiple levels of, sometimes through multiple levels of translations. So that's some kinds of practice that we try to embody in our work as well. And another project that I want to introduce is that the oral history project that we it has been a very long-term project, and also to involve massage workers to be the one interview their peers and their friends and friends and families into this thing. And it really and also just kind of having this mutual training. So someone who is not a massage worker, someone who's not a first-generation immigrant will learn from people who are massage worker and first-generation immigrant, and someone who is a researcher in the collective also brings a perspective of what is to do and also bring meaning to our project, and why we're doing this, and what are some of the things that you need to be precautious about as someone dealing with stories that can be that involves violence, that may involve violence, and how do we not give justice to all kinds of events and emotions and histories into the surface.
Thank you so much. Lorelei, do you want to respond to Susan's question?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of different responses. The one is about the archive and the frustration of the lack of archive. And I think, that there are a couple of ways that I have felt good about contending with that. And one is just to admit how much I don't know, and to make really clear, like when I'm writing about this, that, I might imagine here's one possible subjectivity for this person who we know existed. Here's another one. Here are the lenses that these stories have been told through, and here's where they agree with each other and disagree with each other. And at the end of the day, without a first person voice, we don't know. And that is really like in itself the important content, to that has meaning. The fact that we don't know has deep meaning. And then the other thing I would just mention, because every time I think about subjectivity in the archive, I think of Saidiya Hartman and her book, which, now I am blanking on the name of it. It's on my bookshelf, but maybe somebody else here knows what I'm talking about. But her most recent book, I'll find it.
How do you lose your mother?
Oh, maybe it's not her most recent. Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments. Yeah, that's it. Thank you, folks in the chat. She really writes about that experience, and then she creates this multi-genre project attempt to give subjectivity to folks where the archive is slim. So that's a beautiful approach. But then I was also thinking about how we're doing it in the present day, as Yanhu and Sue Ellen, I think, are talking about. And I had some thought about that, but now it's gone. Anyway, I'm sorry.
No, the timing is actually great, because we are going to I think the way to do this is I'm going to actually just read the multitude of questions that have come through, just so that they're out there and you can see how your comments have kind of sparked what issues they've sparked for others, and then you can respond as we move forward. So there have been questions about the potential negative consequences of decreasing police force and presence, that there's increasing attention to this idea that there's not enough cops on the streets as agencies have slowed or frozen, and people want to know what you think of this argument. Another question is, how much of the Page Act was a genuine effort to address trafficking issues? How much was about limiting Asian immigration? Another question was, from in the more recent past, have the women who engaged in the sex and massage trade, have they initially been forced laborers or not? That was another question. So there's some questions that tend to come up a lot around these issues, I think. Another question is really more factual. What is the current state of the Atlanta murder charges? And the last thing I saw was that the death penalty was being sought, and that was of concern to some organizations, and that it was being hate crime charges were being sought. But I think people would love to hear an update. And then and also some people are interested in preventing the kind of, what do you see as the best ways to prevent the kind of incident we saw in Atlanta? All right, so does anybody want to take a stab at one of those questions?
I can jump in and just buy up folks some time. And I do think that this kind of responds to perhaps the first question about, what is our positionality as academics, right? In terms, the way I approach this, and there's something that Yanhu actually brought up, is that to call for ethical and care ways in which to engage, right, different cultural sectors and supporting these efforts. And I do think that this is something that folks that are, educators and folks that are, in and out of academia academia, this is something that we could kind of strive to do, right? To me, I think I approach this as doing bridge work, right? So like bridging these different sectors, and in part, doing the advocacy work, right? The advocacy of, popularizing these discussions, right? Popularizing these discussions so it doesn't have to be in select places. Bring it into the classroom, bring it into core curriculum, right? Have freshmen undergrads talk about this, have K through 12. And I think this brings up the work that Sue Ellen is doing, right? That if we can actually make this conversation actually nuanced from the get-go, we can save a lot of work, right? Like we don't have to go through 2 hours of kind of rehearsing like these tired narratives that will just kind of, we can actually start doing the work, like get to the precision, right? That what all of my co-panelists are talking about, because they have been doing the work, right? Like we need to actually help support that for folks that are actually doing the work on the ground, right? This is what we as educators that have platforms can do, right? We can support that by actually making a more actually educated and informed and nuanced conversation from the get-go, so folks could actually join in the coalition building in a very informed and actually nuanced way. And I do think that that is the responsibility of the intellectual, of the educator, of folks that are doing educational work. And so this is kind of what I think is the bridge work. And I think to like relieve the burden, but also support in any way materially, but also intellectually, the work that is happening on the ground with real people, right? On top of that, I do think the kind of in-between place of folks that are intellectuals and or in education is also the work that Lorelai actually brought up, right? Is to kind of figure out different ways of reading and taking and understanding meaning, right? Like that lived experience is theories in the flesh, right? It's not a kind of going back to Janelle's point to refuse those binaries, right? Between organizing and culture work, right? That organizing and culture work and sex work are different levels of very similar conversations. We have to be precise about the ways in which they diverge in relationship to power, but we can't see them as dichotomies, because when we see them as dichotomies, we lose these links, right? And so when we lose these links, we lose possible coalitional potential. We lose time, we waste time, right? In terms of the work that we can do together. And I think, and this is the last thing I'll say before I kind of hand it off to everyone, why I got into this research was because my parents were organizers, and they were organized specifically around sex work decriminalization in Taiwan during the 90s. So that was kind of that early moment that Lorelai was talking about, that, Asian countries have been organizing around this for a very long time because we've had to deal with this. Japanese imperialism, it's not just US imperialism, you have kind of layered Japanese imperialism, questions of comfort stations, and that these comfort stations were inherited by the US military. So we're talking about multi-layers of imperial expansion in this question about sex work, right? And sex work justice. What was interesting to me is that kind of seeing them on the ground doing this work, kind of them join coalition with folks in South Korea, folks in South Asia, was really inspiring for me growing up. But also I was hungry for more, right? Like to me, it felt like it was kind of it was trying to grapple with questions about abolition, questions about carcerality, but I wanted to join that conversation, right? If this is about the kind of multi-layers of empire, I wanted to kind of figure out how that connects with conversations that was happening in the US, organizations that were coalescing and making coalitions in North America. How does those come together? Because if we think about the Page Act, it was a Trans-Pacific project from the very beginning, right? And so that is just kind of probably my response to a few of the questions, right? Like what is the work we can do, but also kind of how do we deal with the fact that we are losing archive, but also what is ethical ways to move forward? And I see, and I can only speak from my own positionality, and that is kind of the bridge work that I do advocate, and I'm just calling on everyone here, right? Use me as a bridge, and that is kind of my commitments to you all.
Sue Ellen. And then Lorelai, looks like you want to jump in, either of you? All right, Lorelai.
I just am really inspired by Lily to respond to. I mean, just everything that you're saying, and understanding this, how we need to approach all of this with precision and complexity at the same time. And so there were a couple of questions I wrote down, which is, was the Page Act a genuine attempt to address trafficking? And were the workers actually undergoing forced labor? And so just to start with, I would say, like, yes and no. No, sorry, yes and we don't know is where I want to start with. Because what I would like to talk about is how the Page Act is similar to the anti-trafficking laws that continue to pass. FOSTA in 2018, we continue to get anti-trafficking laws, the TVPA in the early 2000s, that imagine trafficking as something really different from work. And so if we look back at working conditions for most people in the end of the 19th century, we can see very clearly that most people at that time, and particularly non-white people, had very limited choices for survival. And if we call this trafficking because it involves sex work, that to me is a separation of this kind of labor from other kinds of labor. And I think it misunderstands the fact that you can be trafficked into work. I think people are often saying, oh, sex work is something totally separate from trafficking. Sex work contains consensual work and trafficking contains non-consensual work. But that is not how we experience it as sex workers and as trafficking survivors. My understanding of myself as a person who's been trafficked was something I learned by going to law school and finding out how the law defines trafficking, which is a little bit different from how it's defined in the movies. And basically, trafficking is extreme labor exploitation. And so if we think about that, that's a spectrum. It is also, we need to acknowledge that folks' working conditions, people have more or less control over their working conditions. The same person at different times. We go in and out of these experiences where sometimes we have a little more stability, maybe a little more economic stability, and we get to turn down the gig that looks a little bit like scary, the dude who looks a little bit scary. And then at other times we don't have that privilege. And so we're surviving, we're continuing to use trading sex as a survival strategy. I also kind of think whether it's work or not is a little bit perhaps only useful in the ways that it links us to other labor movements. But when we try to fit it into work, into labor theory, we miss how trading sex is also a survival strategy for folks who have rejected other forms of labor that are more easily contained in this category we call work. And we misunderstand then how the imperialist projects of rescuing sex workers in order to train them to sew are actually moving those folks backwards into the kinds of labor they had already rejected to find a different survival strategy. Now, these are experiences that we know are contemporarily happening, whether the women who are working in the Chinese American brothels in the late 19th century were having these same experiences. I'm going to say that because human experience has never not been complicated, that there is at least some complication in terms of their experiences of agency, of control around their work, of choice, which is a whole other thing that, like, nobody, I think, who's in this who was a working class person in the late 19th century would have thought, oh, I'm choosing my work because it gives me dignity, as Catherine McKinnon wrote in the New York Times last week. These ideas are very modern, I think, being put backward onto groups of people. And the important thing, I think, is just for us to remember that any time we turn these workers into symbols of either symbols of feminist, there are pieces of writing that call these women feminist pioneers, that say that they were rejecting gender stereotypes and by doing this work, and were totally knowledgeable about the folks who are rescuing them, and so we're just using them for resources. So there's a very agented perspective that is kind of turning a person into a symbol in the same way that turning a person into a victim is also a symbol, and that both of these things reduce people's lived experiences today and then to something that's just not really useful when you're trying to write a policy. And that's why the Page Act, as certainly a genuine, potentially, because these laws are written by lots of people, you can imagine there's some people who think the Page Act is genuinely trying to address trafficking or labor exploitation. And the same way that FOSTA does, but they are imagining a totally different narrative, a reductive narrative of people's lives. And so they fail. They write a law that actually is harmful to the people they claim to be trying to help.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to actually turn it over to Susan to invite some last remarks.
Thank you so much, Janelle, and thank you so much for all the comments that you have all offered today. Before we get started on wrapping, I just want to ask if either Yanhu or Sue Ellen, you guys have last remarks to share, any closing comments for the crowd?
I just want to quickly say that thank you again, and I have learned so much, and know that we have so much more work ahead of us, and that the complexity of the issues historically, many of these policies were made response to, the fear. Oftentimes the fears is real or not real, and today we are in the societies that a lot of misinformation, and it's causing this polarized, society. I think in more of dialogues that we could, have and provide that opportunity to people to understand, to dispel a lot of these myths will be very, very, important.
I also just want to say that thank you so much for having me and everyone in this space to be together. I think my response to the question about whether what percentage of these current migrant workers are trafficked or in enforced labor is that, well, I absolutely agree with everything that Lorelei has beautifully explained, that human lives are so complicated, and that the level of coercion and voluntariness of labor is a spectrum. But my experience with building relationships with Asian sex and migrant workers is that they all enter the industry for various reasons, through various means and modes of immigration, and for some people, this is the only lucrative job of which that they can take advantage at the moment to support themselves and their family. And we do still see workers reporting violence from their employers, in addition to law enforcement, which are actually primarily the major aggressors to them. But employers do experience all these conflicts within their workplace, and wage theft and violence. And our goal is not to undermine all these violence that happen to them, but actually what we try to do is, instead of approaching this as by studying them or creating another law to regulate their lives, we propose, what if we approach this problem by giving them voices and empowering them with more associational power and bargaining power, and maybe like, what if there was a trade union that where the membership span across subsectors of the various caretaking workers, including sex workers, massage workers, domestic workers, and have them be the one who point out the problem within their industry, instead of the people outside of the industry pointing to a problem, coming with an assumption that is not accurate. Yeah, that's all I want to say.
Yeah, thank you so much to Yeonhu and Sue Ellen. Again, you are all so brilliant, and I've learned so much. I'm sure that every single person in the audience can say the same. And I think that this is, really the central thesis, I guess, of Timeless Echoes, is that you remind us how history isn't just something static that's in the past and that we learn in textbooks or in a classroom, but that we're all living and making history, and that there are so many lenses we can apply to the past. That also means that there are so many futures and possibilities ahead of us. So thank you so much again to all of our panelists for how vibrant this dialogue has been. Thank you for Janelle, Professor Wong, for being a brilliant moderator. Thank you to everyone for how capacious your thought and your work are, and for the care and the solidarity that you've embodied for us today. And with all of that being said, I'll pass it over to Ted for closing comments.
Yeah, I want to thank all of you guys as well. I mean, it's just really a brilliant group of people. So much insights that you guys have. I've learned so much. Janelle, maybe just a couple of remarks from you, just to give you a chance to close, because in sort of like your summary, the professor's summary thoughts, and we go from there.
Well, I just feel like this has been such a rich conversation, and the nuances that have been raised here today, both in terms of the past and the present, have, I think, really helped us to understand the current moment and give us some direction for moving forward. So I appreciate the careful framing, the voices from the ground, and the attention to organizing also have all been, I think, really, really important here. Something that we don't hear very often in many panels like this. So I'll just close with that word of appreciation to you all.
Right. Yeah, and I echo that too. And some of the things you say really resonate to me. We need to have another discussion. Maybe we'll talk about it in the next session. We have usually, after these sort of presentations, we have sort of a hangout period in which we open mic and we stop recording, and so you can feel free to say whatever you want to. But before you get there, I just want to say again, thank you each of the panelists for all your great insights and thoughts. And also I want to make sure that we thank Susan Lee for having organized this thing particularly. So thank her. And also I want to thank the backroom operators, that's Stan Liu, and also all the other, we have Kenny, and we also have Bianca, and we also have Mae, who have worked these programs, and really it's a remarkable record that they have put together. It's about 10 years worth of these type of programs. Good, bad, small, little, but all very interesting, I think. So I give you thoughts about what we're planning. We do have lined up an episode on Bruce Lee and DC. I think Rita Hayden and Harry Chowger, we talk about their personal experience with the famous Bruce Lee wandering in DC before he became famous. We'll have to have that set up. We have to finalize the dates and for that, but stay tuned. And then please join our mailing list to get the latest. We also have a talk story with the Chinese American World War II gold medal presentation, which is going to be on October 29 and 30 for galas. We'll have it open. We'll have a story sharing corner in which veterans can come talk and tell us short stories or long stories. That should be interesting. And we also have currently going on if you guys are in DC, go down to Adams Morgan, go over there and go see the booth in front of MEEPS. And we have a information thing there. We have people working on the context study, the API context study, and they'd love to get your thoughts about what makes a good DC. So Janelle, you have to come out. You're in DC, you have no excuse. So come out there and
Lily too.
Yeah, so that's going forth. And there are a number of things happening. Just stay tuned to our Talk Story series. One of the things that I hope we can do, like I say, we're probably offline now, right, Kevin? So we just do hangout type thing. Let everybody open. You guys can raise